Hello again. I'm Kathleen Dunn. You're listening to the Ideas Network of Wisconsin Public Radio for this Friday, the 25th of May. Vincent Bugliosi is our guest this hour of the program. He has written a 1,600-page book that is getting phenomenal reviews. It is titled Reclaiming History, The Assassination of President John Kennedy. I've been carrying it around for a couple days, and I got bigger muscles in my arms as a result of it. The text is far larger and heavier than any that Oswald may have handled in the hours before he pointed his gun out of the sixth-floor window of the book depository in Dallas, Texas. It is longer than the Warren Report. It is longer than all kinds of books on this subject combined. But the reviews are saying that it is so well done, that is so exhaustive. The LA Times reviewer said that with this work, Bugliosi has definitively explained the murder that recalibrated modern America. It is a book for the ages, and it is his exhaustive research showing that it was Lee Harvey Oswald and Lee Harvey Oswald alone. We are, I know many of you are very interested in this subject. We're going to have a lot of phone calls, so call in 800-486-8655, 800-486-8655. If you're joining us in Milwaukee, it is 414-227-2050, 414-227-2050. Hello, Vincent. Thanks so much for being with us.
Hi, Kathleen.
Hi.
I'm very happy to be on the show.
Yeah, great to have you here. Tell me where you were November 22nd of 1963 and what thoughts were going through your mind then. Did you think that did you sort of take that it was a lone assassin then, it was Lee Harvey Oswald, or did questions about all of this, your interest in this, start back in 1963? Where were you?
Well, you've asked a couple questions. The first question, where was I? I was in the hallway at the law school at UCLA in Westwood, California, and I don't know who told me. Someone told me that the president had been shot, and I was the president of the senior class, and I walked into each of the rooms and announced it, and of course the professors canceled the classes for the day. As far as my feelings were concerned, I really did not study this case because I was very heavily involved in prosecuting murder cases down at the DA's office. There was something about it that didn't sound right to me, and it was the only thing. But I was not a conspiracy theorist or anything like that. But I wondered why the records were sealed for 75 years, because, the normal assumption is you seal something if you're trying to cover it up.
Right.
Why was the Warren Commission sealing the records for 75 years? Today, 99.99% of the American public still believe that the Warren Commission sealed the records, but they did not. It's a total misconception.
Oh, my.
I point out in the book that in the cover letter that Earl Warren, he was the head of the Warren Commission, sent in transferring all of the Warren Commission documents over to the National Archives. He expressly said that he wanted the fullest disclosure possible of these documents to the American people. Now, the records were initially sealed for 75 years, but it had nothing to do with the Warren Commission. It was an old National Archives rule that when they received record and documents from a federal investigative body, they sealed the records for 75 years, believed to be the normal lifespan of a human. Now, since that rule, or since the time of the assassination, that rule has been completely eviscerated, at least with respect to the Kennedy case. The Freedom of Information Act in 1966 and the JFK Act in 1992 totally eviscerated that. At the present time, a very small fraction of 1% of the millions of pages pertaining to the assassination have not been released to the American public. However, and this is the important point, that small fraction of 1% has been seen. So 100% of the documents have been seen by the House Select Committee in 1978, and later the Assassination Records Review Board in 1994, 5, and 96. They've seen all the documents unredacted, but a small fraction of the documents, they're all available to the public, but a small fraction have redacted material in them.
What is it about this assassination? Was it the conspiracy books that you thought were just wrong? Or this is a major, huge project. This is a huge book. This is years and years of your life.
right.
So what is it about this particular case?
I first got involved in this case in 1986 when London Weekend Television asked me to, quote, prosecute Oswald in a docu-trial in London. Jerry Spence, do you know who that is?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, well, he defended Oswald. And my first instinct was no. I've always turned down these artificial courtroom settings. But they said, wait a while, this is totally different. We know about your love affair with the yellow pad. There's not going to be any script. That sounded good to me. The script's going to be your yellow pad. You and Spence are going to have close to a half a year to work on this. We got the original Warren Commission witnesses. That was very impressive.
I know,
a regular
amazing.
federal judge, a regular federal jury chosen from the jury rolls of the Dallas Federal District Court, and they said it was going to be 28 hours. It turned out to be 21 hours in London. And that convinced me that I should get involved in this case. And Spence and I went at it for 21 hours in London. The jury came back with a verdict of guilty, the Dallas jury. And Time magazine said it was the closest to a real trial that the accused assassin would likely ever had. It was during that time that I reached two conclusions, and two things became obvious to me. One, the conspiracy theorists had always accused the Warren Commission of suppressing the truth and distorting the facts, and I found out that it was they, not the Warren Commission, who were guilty of the precise thing that they were accusing the Warren Commission of. Secondly, I found out that there was absolutely no substance to all these conspiracy theories. Some of them, at first blush, were intellectually palatable, but upon scrutiny, none of them survived scrutiny, and yet I knew that the overwhelming majority of Americans were buying into it. And it was at that point in 1986 that I decided to do a book trying to educate the American people. Why did it take me so long, and why is this book so thick? There are two realities in this case. Well, first, it's the first book that covered the entire case, so that's one reason for the length. But there's a more important reason here. The Kennedy assassination, at its core, is a very, very simple case. Chief Justice Warren used to be the DA in Oakland, and he said it would be a 2-3 day murder case if it had not been for the president being the victim. And
really?
I agree with him. Within hours of the shooting in Dealey Plaza, virtually everyone in Dallas law enforcement knew that Oswald killed Kennedy. And when they found out about his background and what a complete kook he was, they formed the opinion that there was no conspiracy involved. So at its core, this is a very simple case. But there's another reality here, Kathleen, and that's why the book is as long as it is. Because of the unceasing and fanatical obsession by literally, and I'm not exaggerating here, literally thousands upon thousands of Warren Commission critics and conspiracy theorists from around the world. Last night I was supposed to be interviewed by the BBC, and then something else came up, so they're going to interview me in the future. But throughout the world, these people have put this case under a high-powered microscope and investigated every conceivable aspect of this case for close to 44 years. They've made hundreds upon hundreds of allegations, and they've taken this simple case and transformed it into its present state. And what's its present state? I'll tell you, Kathleen, what its present state is. It is now the most complex murder case by far in world history. Nothing even remotely comes close. Just to give you an example, in manuscript form, one of my endnotes, I'm talking about an endnote, one endnote, not the main text, on acoustics, ran to about 120 pages with 60 footnotes. But that's because of the conspiracy theorists who will not stop making allegations. And basically I'm telling them, and they don't like it, but in effect I'm telling them that they've wasted the last 10, 15 years of their life, and people don't like to be told that.
Vincent Bugliosi is our guest, Reclaiming History, the Assassination of President John F. Kennedy. This book is huge, and Mr. Bugliosi argues that it is beyond all doubt that Lee Harvey Oswald murdered Kennedy, and beyond a reasonable doubt that Oswald acted alone. It is supported by more than 10,000 citations. It is the first of nearly 1,000 books about the assassination to attempt a comprehensive and fair evaluation of the entire case, including all of the major conspiracy theories. Let's go to phone calls, and we'll start with Bob from Middleton. Hello, Bob.
Hi there. I have a couple of concerns. One is the Zapruder film seemed to me to clearly show that when Kennedy was hit, his head moved backwards toward the book depository building by the impact of the bullet. I mean, and simple physics, indicates that the weight of the bullet times the velocity gives you a number of foot-pounds of pressure pushing in that direction, which seems to be the opposite direction. But the second thing that really bothers me is that I really don't think that there's anyone on Earth who could have assassinated Kennedy, a moving target, at that angle that to me looks like it's somewhere between 30 and 45 degrees down a declivity from the window of the book depository building, with that $19.98 used Italian hunting rifle.
Bob, you're getting someone of my age. If you could confine yourself to one question. You've asked two. I'm apt to forget the first one you asked. You asked two very, very good questions, but they're totally separate, and I will deal with them separately. Let's talk about the first one first, and then I'll have to ask you to remind me what your second one was about the Manico Carcano. You're talking about the so-called head snap to the rear, which you see so clearly on the Zapruder film, and the inferences. It was first shown in 1975 on Geraldo Rivera, Good Night America. Millions of people saw it, and understandably drew the inference that if the head snapped to the rear, the shot must have come from the right front where the grassy knoll was, not from the rear where Oswald was in the book depository building. And at the trial in London, Jerry Spence showed that segment of the film no less than 5 times, and I didn't even object, and to it shown more than one time. And he said it looked like Babe Ruth, it struck the president from the front and knocked his head backwards. And he says, Mr. Bugliosi is trying to convince you folks that what you've seen with your very own eyes didn't happen. And if I did not have an answer for that, I think the jury in London would have come back with a not guilty verdict, because that would have raised a reasonable doubt of guilt. But here's the answer, Bob. The answer is that if you look at the individual frames, and you cannot see it by looking at the film, you have to look at the individual frames. At frame 312, and I showed the jury on a screen these frames, and I have them in the book. I think this is the only book ever published that shows these individual frames. They show certain frames, but here I show the actual sequence of these frames. At frame 312, the president's head is okay. This is frame 312 of the Zapruder film. At frame 313, which is 1/18th of a second later, there's 18.3 frames per second. The president is hit in the head. You see the explosion to the head. And in what direction, Bob, is the president's head pushed at frame 313? It's pushed forward, not backwards, indicating a shot from the rear. So at where Oswald was. So at the all-important moment of impact, that's much more important than what you actually see on the film. At the all-important moment of impact, the president's head is pushed forward 2.3 inches. And then at frames 314 to 321, you see this head snap to the rear caused by a neuromuscular reaction, nerve damage to the president's brain caused by the bullet, caused his back muscles to tighten, which in turn caused the president's head to snap to the rear. You talk about a moving target. It was not. My firearms guy from Wisconsin,
really?
Lutz, he was my firearms expert, testified in London that for all intents and purposes, the president was a stationary target. When you talk about angles, Bob, the angles would be from the so-called grassy knoll, because from the grassy knoll, the president's limousine would be traveling from left to right. It would be a moving target, but at the window, it was virtually a stationary target. I think I've addressed myself to both of your questions.
Yeah, you did. Thank you very much for the call. Mike is next from Wisdom, Montana. Hi, Mike.
Hi. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
Hey, I just wanted to know if Mr. Bugliosi was aware of the story that's all over the news this week about the ammunition study at Texas A&M University, the work of Cliff Spiegelman. And if you could comment on that.
It really upsets me when stuff like this happens, because it's every day and it never ends. And someone said, well, are you aware of this news story when I was in Washington, D.C.? I said, it's not new. I'll tell you how new it is, okay? It's already in my book. My book came out a week and a half ago. That's an old story. And if you want, I can waste time talking about it. It's a non-story, but it is not a new story. The whole issue is discussed in considerable depth in my book. If you want me to go on further, I'll do it. But believe me, it's a non-story. It's not a new story. It's an old one.
It's up to you how you want to comment on it. And
well, here's what it is. It deals with neutron activation analysis, and if you take metallic fragments and you put them under a nuclear reactor with the sophisticated instrumentation, the reactor tells you the elemental composition of the bullet, the so-called trace elements like silver, antimony, copper, etc. And it had always been believed that when you find two bullets with a similar concentration of these trace elements, that they came from the same batch of lead. But subsequent studies, way before these two fellows now that want to get in the news and have succeeded in its silliness, subsequent studies have shown that you can have two bullets coming from separate batches of lead with similar concentrations of these trace elements. But the point is, the single bullet theory, which we haven't gotten into,
no,
the so-called magic bullet, is not dependent on that. That was just a corroborative thing. It's not dependent at all upon the thing that we've just been talking about. So these are just two guys coming up with a study that reaffirms what we already know. It's already in my book, and it's not a major issue. But we wasted, not wasted, we talked about 3 or 4 minutes about something that's not important, but there are many things that are important. Is Oswald guilty? And was there a conspiracy? I don't know if we're going to have time to get into that, but these are the important things. The magic bullet is a very, very important
Let's
thing.
talk about the magic bullet. This is the thing I think that a lot of people had a hard time taking in, that the one of the bullets that struck Kennedy then hit Connally, this magic bullet, which people say had to make all these turns, and it was impossible for that to happen. Tell me about what you think about the magic bullet.
Well, Kathleen, the magic bullet is a perfect example of these conspiracy theorists. They have the audacity not only to say things that are directly controverted by documentary evidence, but they even lie about things that are controverted by actual photographs and film. Now, why do they lie about that? Because they think they can get by with it. Maybe only 1 out of 100 people reading their nonsense are unaware of the photograph, and they don't have access to the film. Here's what they do with the magic bullet in their sketches. I show the sketch in the photo section of my book. What they do, they put Governor Connally in the presidential limousine directly in front of President Kennedy, directly in front. And then they say a shot coming from the right rear where Oswald was and passing on a straight line through Kennedy's body, through soft tissue. Once it exited his throat, they say, to hit Connally, it would have had to make a right turn in midair and then a left turn to hit Connally, and they say bullets don't do that, and that's the so-called magic bullet. Now, in London, Jerry Spence called Dr. Cyril Wecht to the witness stand. He was the coroner at the time of Allegheny County in Pittsburgh, and Spence asked Wecht to characterize this bullet, and he says, well, it's a magic bullet. It makes turns in midair, and bullets don't even do that in cartoons. So on cross-examination, I said, now, Dr. Wecht, if this bullet, which you concede traveled on a straight line through soft tissue in Kennedy's body, you concede that. I said, if it did not go on to hit Governor Connally, as you claim it did not, why didn't it tear up the interior of the limousine or hit the driver? And he said, I don't know. I didn't conduct the investigation. But I said, Dr. Wecht, it sounds like now that you have your own magic bullet. I said, if it did not hit Connally, did not hit the interior of the limousine, did not hit the driver, I said, it must have zigzagged to the left. And he said, no, it need not have zigzagged to the left. I said, well, did it hop, skip, and jump over the car? And he said, no, it need not have performed any remarkable feat like that. I said, well, then, Dr. Wecht, tell this Dallas jury, this was in London, but these were Dallas folks, tell this jury here what happened to that bullet after it exited President Kennedy's throat. And he said, I don't know. So it turns out, Kathleen, that although the conspiracy theorists have wrapped this magic bullet around the neck of the Warren Commission for 44 years, saying it's a bogus bullet, it's they, Kathleen. They are the only ones who have a magic bullet. Because if we're to believe them, after it exits the president's throat, it apparently vanishes without a trace into thin air. It's all nonsense. But they've succeeded. They've been very successful in conning the American public into believe nonsense like the magic bullet. There was no magic bullet. The orientation of Connally's body vis-a-vis Kennedy was such that a bullet passing through Kennedy had nowhere else to go but to hit Governor Connally, which is exactly what happened.
Paul is calling from San Francisco. Hi, Paul.
Is it Paul?
Paul,
Hi,
yes.
Kathleen.
Hi, Paul.
I was in the invasion of Cuba, the Bay of Pigs invasion, and
Yes.
my hello.
Yes,
I
we're
said,
here.
I'm impressed with that. You were in Brigade 2506?
No, I was in the U.S. Navy.
Oh.
And the Navy participated in this extensively. My commanding officer was George Bush Sr. I was based in Patuxent River, Maryland, and this was one of the staging areas for the invasion of Cuba. But I noticed, like, the ships that were used for the invasion of Cuba were named after Barbara, and the operation was called Operation Zapata. And George Bush eventually became the head of the CIA, and I thought it was sort of like a mafia hit where you earn rank by who you kill. And so I always suspected George Bush was one of the supervisors of the Kennedy assassination, and that's why he became the head of the CIA, because of the good work he did in Dallas.
So you think George Bush got Oswald to kill Kennedy? I obviously, in all deference to you, Paul, I think that's kind of silly on its face. There's no evidence that George Bush got Oswald to kill Kennedy, and that's why, Kathleen, we should get into the issue if we have time, as to whether Oswald is guilty and whether there's a conspiracy. We're missing those two main issues, and we're peripherally talking about things like this, which would be subsumed if we talked about the main issues, and I don't know if we're going to have time to get into it. But if you believe that, Paul, that George Bush Sr. Orchestrated the conspiracy, there's nothing that I can do to discourage you or to dissuade you from that view, except that you have no evidence of that. And I can't say anything more than that. I got a call from someone who said that came up with this. I've heard the George Bush theory before, but they came up with a theory over the phone a couple of days ago that I'd never heard of, that Lady Bird Johnson was behind it because she wanted to be the first lady. I said, I've heard of LBJ allegedly being behind the assassination. I'd never heard of Lady Bird.
No, I haven't heard that either.
And I don't know who's going to be next. Maybe the current president, who would have been a child at that time.
Yeah.
But, it's all silliness.
Let's spend some time on Oswald. How carefully did he plan the strike against Kennedy?
Well, we're still staying away from guilt and conspiracy, and if you want to do that, Kathleen, I have all the respect in the world from you, but we're going to end up this hour without talking about
we'll get
guilt.
To it. We'll get to it.
Because of your questions, none of them deal specifically with whether he was guilty. None of them deal with whether there was a conspiracy. Your question is how much did he prepare for it?
Yeah, did he prepare for it by himself? Was it an elaborate preparation? Why did he prepare this way? What were his motivations for this?
Well, you've got all types of questions there. Do you want to talk about motive?
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about motive. No one knows for sure why Oswald killed Kennedy. Even if he were alive today, he might not be able to tell us the dynamics swirling around in his mind that caused him to do this horrendous, monstrous act of murder. But there's certain circumstantial evidence from which we can draw inferences. Oswald was whatever the word is, he had delusions of grandeur. He viewed himself in a historical light. His diary, he called the historical diary. A squad mate of his in the Marines said that Oswald wanted to do something that 10,000 years from now people would be talking about it. His wife, Marina, said that her husband compared himself to the great historical figures of history whom he read about in biographies. He was a dyslexic, but nonetheless he was a voracious reader of biographies. So here, clearly, Kathleen is a person who didn't just want to make a ripple, but wanted to change the tide of history. Getting more specific about your question, which is a very good question, why did he do it? Oswald revered Fidel Castro, was an ardent supporter of the Castro Revolution. In fact, in late September, just a month and a half or so before the assassination, he tried to get to Cuba by way of the Cuban consulate in Mexico City, and he was turned down, and he almost cried, and became very, very, very angry. Obviously, he was against Kennedy for the Bay of Pigs invasion that was alluded to earlier, where the Kennedy administration was trying to overthrow Castro. 5 days before the assassination, Kennedy in Miami gave a foreign policy speech in which he all but urged the Cuban people to rise up against Castro, promising prompt U.S. aid if they did. And I agree with the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee that the Castro angle certainly was a contributing factor in the motivation, in that Oswald probably felt by killing an enemy of Castro he was somehow furthering the Cuban cause. Mm-hmm. I came across something else during my preparation for the trial that meant more to me perhaps than the average person. Manson, when he ordered these murders, he did not know precisely who the victims were, but he knew that they were representatives of the establishment, and he hated the establishment. And I'm reading Oswald's diary, and he has an entry in there that leapt off the page to me. He said, I've lived under capitalism and communism, and I quote, despise the representatives, that's the key word, the representatives of both systems, unquote. Now, Oswald did not really hate Lee Harvey Oswald. Oswald did not really hate President John F. Kennedy. In fact, he was very supportive of Kennedy's civil rights bills, and his wife felt that he did not hate Kennedy, and Spence argued in London, why would he kill someone he did not hate? But we do know this. We do know this beyond all doubt. He hated the United States of America, absolutely hated. He wouldn't even let Marina learn English over here. Hated the United States. So I argued to the jury, and no one knows, but I said, take into consideration that to Oswald, Kennedy may have been the quintessential representative of a society for which he held a grinding contempt, and when he was shooting at Kennedy, he was shooting at the United States of America. But I have to add, by way of a footnote, Kathleen, I've put people on death row without knowing, beyond all doubt, what their motive was. All I knew was that they had killed the victim, and there was no legal justification for what they did. Motive is not an element of the corpus delicti of any crime. And whatever Oswald's motive was, we know he did it. And I would like to get into that if we have a chance as to why I'm saying he did it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, let me try to summarize billions and billions of words into just a minute or two, if I can do it. From my experience as a prosecutor, and I don't think it requires that, I think it's just common sense. If you're innocent of a crime, Kathleen, chances are there's not going to be any evidence pointing towards your guilt at all. Why? Because you're innocent. But now and then, because of the nature of life, the unaccountability of certain things, now and then a piece of evidence will point towards guilt, even though you're innocent. And in some unusual, rare situation, even two or maybe even three pieces of evidence curiously point towards guilt, even though you're completely innocent. But in Reclaiming History, Kathleen, I set forth 53 separate pieces of evidence that point irresistibly to Oswald's guilt. And under those circumstances, Kathleen, it would not be humanly possible for Oswald to be innocent, at least not in the world in which we live. I'm talking to you, and you and your audience can hear me. There will be a dawn tomorrow. Not in that world. Only in a fantasy world can you have 53 pieces of evidence pointing towards your guilt and still be innocent? Very briefly, let me just give you a couple of the pieces of evidence. The Mannlicher Carcano rifle, one of your callers was suggesting that, how could this rifle do it? Well, it was proven to be the murder weapon. Monty Lutz from Wisconsin was one of the people that came to that conclusion out of 9. It was the murder weapon. And that murder weapon was owned and possessed by Lee Harvey Oswald. It was his weapon. Pretty powerful evidence. Number 2, Oswald was the only employee, of the Book Depository building to flee the building after the shooting in Dealey Plaza. Everyone else stayed there. He took off. 45 minutes later, he shoots and kills Officer J.D. Tippett of the Dallas Police Department. I told the jury in London that murder bore the signature of a man in desperate flight from some awful deed. 30 minutes later, he resists arrest at the Texas Theater, pulls a gun on the arresting officer. During his interrogation, he told one provable lie after another, all of which show an unmistakable consciousness of guilt. And I give 48 other reasons in Reclaiming History as to why this man is guilty. And when someone tells me that he's innocent, I know one of two things, that either he's totally unfamiliar with the evidence or he's just a silly person. Now, on the separate issue of conspiracy, we can't get into each issue or each conspiracy theory because it would go on for a couple hours, but I can say this. No credible, and let's italicize the word credible, no credible evidence has emerged that the CIA or mob or military industrial complex was involved in this assassination. And I told the jury in London, I said, you know, folks, I said, I'll stipulate that 3 people can keep a secret, I said, but only if 2 are dead. And here we have now close to 44 years later, and not one word, not other than the silliness from people like Hunt's sons claiming that he knew exactly what happened. And that's not credible, and I've already addressed myself to that. Not one word, not one syllable has leaked out that's credible that any of these groups were behind the assassination. Number 2, there's no evidence that Oswald had any connection or association with any of these groups. And we know that the FBI checked out everything this guy did from the moment that he arrived back in the States from the Soviet Union on June 13th, 1962 to the date of the assassination. Harold Weisberg, one of the most thorough assassination critics ever, he was a conspiracy theorist, but very thorough and very honest, he himself said the FBI checked out every breath that this guy breathed. And they conducted 25,000 interviews and could find no evidence that he had any association with any of these groups believed to be behind the assassination. Assuming, for the sake of argument, that one of these groups decided to kill the president. I reject it out of hand. It belongs in a Robert Ludlum novel. But in the book, of course, I go into great depth on all of these theories. But let's assume that one of them decided to kill the president. Oswald would be one of the last people, Kathleen, on the face of this earth whom they would go to kill the president. Number 1, he was not an expert shot. He was a good shot, but not an expert shot. He had this $12 mail-order rifle. He was notoriously unreliable, extremely unstable. I mean, here's a guy, Kathleen, that defects to the Soviet Union pre-Gorbachev. I mean, even today, who in the world defects to the Soviet Union, one of the bleakest places on earth? He gets over there. He wants to become a Soviet citizen. They turn him down. And what does he do? He tries to commit suicide. He slashes his wrist. I mean, the exact type of person, I'm being sarcastic here now,
right.
The exact type of person that the CIA or mob would rely upon to commit the biggest murder in American history. Let me take it one further step before we get into other questions. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that one of these groups decided to kill the president, and number 2, for whatever crazy, bizarre reason, they wanted Oswald to be the hitman. Let's see if where that takes us makes any sense. Once Oswald left the book depository building, Kathleen, one of 2 things would have happened. Let me tell you the least likely thing first. The least likely thing is that there would have been a car waiting for him to help him escape down to Mexico or wherever. Obviously, the conspirators would not want their hitman to be apprehended and interrogated by the authorities, because he could put the hat on someone above him, and then that person puts the hat on someone else. Before you know it, it comes back to them. That's the least likely scenario. The most likely thing that would have happened by far, and I think, Kathleen, you already know what I'm going to tell you, there would have been a car waiting for him. If the CIA or mob were behind the assassination and got Oswald to kill Kennedy for them, there would have been a car waiting for him to drive him to his death. And you know that would have happened. And yet we know that Oswald was out on the street with $13 in his pocket trying to flag down buses and cabs. And that fact alone tells any sensible person that these groups were not behind the assassination. Even the parade route, I think I may have touched on it earlier, wasn't even determined until 4 days before the assassination.
Let's go back to some phone calls for you, Vincent. Peter is next from Milwaukee. Hi, Peter.
Hi there.
Go right ahead, Peter.
I am calling to talk about that I've never really believed that if the issue is whether or not Oswald did it, but that there's feelings about who did it. I've always felt that it just kind of encapsulates the way people feel about America after that event, essentially. So I'm just wondering if you have any theories about that aspect, or if your book is strictly the case, or what?
I don't get what your aspect is now, Peter. What aspect now are you talking about?
I think he's talking about how we felt after the assassination, which you get it in the intro to the book, that we kind of lost a part of ourselves, lost a belief in government.
Yeah, I think we've touched upon that. Many people feel that we would not have had the Vietnam War with its cataclysmic consequences that resonate to this very day. I discussed the Vietnam War in considerable depth. My editor said, Vince, unintentionally here, you are writing a book not just about the assassination, but the history of an era. And in the book, I touch on many historical events that in some way relate to the assassination, such as the Vietnam War, because one of the theories is the military-industrial complex says, Kennedy wanted to withdraw troops from Vietnam, and that's why they killed him. And so the Gulf of Tonkin, the Vietnam War, the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Civil Rights Movement, all of these are discussed in the book as they relate to the assassination. The Civil Rights Movement, it was Kennedy whose civil rights bills were eventually enacted into law under LBJ. Kennedy became very, very unpopular in the segregationist South, and that gives rise to another conspiracy theory that the right wing was behind the assassination.
What about all these people who've written these 1,000 other books and have had a lot of people believe them? Why are there so many conspiracy theorists?
Well, for one thing, conspiracy is a lot more interesting. I mean, I at night I don't watch TV because I just don't have any time. But I know that the shows, if they were open and shut cases, no one would watch them. Let me dichotomize the conspiracy community out there. I think the vast majority of conspiracy theorists are very sincere. I think they're patriotic. I think they feel that Kennedy was a great president and that he was killed by dark forces, and they want to illuminate these dark forces and bring these people to justice. Now, I think they're goofy as a $3 bill, but I think they're sincere. I don't feel that way at all about the conspiracy authors. The conspiracy theorists, most of them, 99% of them, I know that because I've been actually talking to these people and interrelating with them for years and years. They don't have the Warren Commission volumes, even the Warren Report. They don't have the House Select Committee volumes, but the authors of these books do, and they flat out lie and distort. There's no question about it. One thing about me that I take pride in, Kathleen, I never, ever make a charge without supporting it. You may not agree with me, but I always offer support. And if you've looked at the book, you see that I give support for everything. And when I'm telling you now that these conspiracy authors flat out lie and distort, I offer evidence of that. Now, why are they doing that? I don't know. It's for the money or what have you.
Thanks to Rita Thomas for producing this hour, and to Rhonda Fanning for on-air production here in our Milwaukee studios, and thanks everybody for your calls. I'm Kathleen Dunn. Have a great Memorial Day weekend. This is the Ideas Network of Wisconsin Public Radio.